My dear friends and colleagues, I hope, I trust everyone who wanted to contribute to this panel is here. I think it is of very important topic, which is called Nationalization of Transnational Business Taxation. It's a bit provocative. Let me warn you, I might suspect what we may be discussing, although I haven't seen the presentations, I haven't talked to the presenters, but this is an opportunity for us to have a discussion in a very lively manner. I don't want to put any time limits, or rather the choice of topic for our presenters, but we need to agree how we should proceed in our dialogue. Do you prefer having presentations and Q&As after each of presentations and discussion, or we leave the Q&As for the end of the panel? So the agreement is let us leave it till the end. Okay, so we've agreed on that at least, but this is my very first time at the legal forum of this very distinguished audience, and I may not be exactly in my element among lawyers. However, at the Ministry of Finance, I deal with various legal matters quite a lot in my capacity, because the legislation is one of the areas of the Ministry of Finance. My name is Sergey Shatalov. I'm Deputy Minister of Finance, and I am responsible for taxation and customs regulation policies, accounting, audits, foreign exchange, and a number of other less significant issues. The topic today for our discussion may be offered because we have received quite a lot of signals in Russia alleging that Russia may be catching up with the international practices and legislation, introducing new institutions that we may not have had so far, although they have been quite common in the West, in Western Europe. In the past 2 years, we have heard a lot about de-offshorization. This is, of course, a very broad topic. Originally, it may have a negative connotation. De-offshorization, one might think, is about eliminating offshores, but this is not the mission, this is not the purpose. And if anyone wanted to do that, that would seem very ambitious and absolutely unrealistic. Offshores came on stream somewhere in the 1950s, and they have been used, and not only for the purpose of evading or avoiding taxation for various tax schemes, but there were other reasons as well. It could be because of a choice of the governing law, a choice of of courts, like or for the purposes of confidentiality for certain transactions, and so even governments in certain countries did not abstain from relying on offshore in case of various sensitive transactions that they didn't want to be publicized. But offshores come both with pluses and minuses, and governments seem to tend to to minimize the negative downsides of offshores, mostly in terms of the set government's revenues, and also because of lack of transparency, lack of understanding, which is a legitimate concern for the legislators and the government. So, what shall we do then? Again, taking you back to recent history, like in 1999, as an example, the OECD was the first to start this efforts to combat the so-called unfair tax competition. There was a forum on transparency, which has become quite a broad one. Many governments are being judged from the point of view of the transparency and openness of tax authorities to cooperation with other authorities and governments. Russia has been assessed from a positive point of view. The results of that assessment was that Russia is more or less in compliance with the criteria of tax transparency. Initially, this efforts to combat unfair competition in taxation were not particularly popular, but then later the situation has changed, and many world and global leaders become involved in the process. You would remember September last year during the G20 meetings, the topic of BS was one of the key topics, and Russia was actually one of the initiators in an effort to coordinate G20 countries and other countries that are not part of the G20 in an effort to eliminate negative implications and provide for level fields in terms of taxation and fill in the gaps that have emerged so far, and there have been quite a few of these gaps. International tax laws emerged as a result of globalization in the economy, and very first issues relating to the taxation of transnational corporations and transactions came up soon after the very first World War, and the League of Nations was provided the auspices, and then the United Nations and the OECD have been very useful. There are quite detailed rules pertaining to tax avoidance. There are thousands of agreements. Russia alone has about over 70 double taxation treaties. They are, of course, all different, and since they are different, experienced lawyers know very well how to exploit these differences to maximize the results of the implications of these differences. They've been quite a few high-profile scandals involving major corporations whereby some of the global leaders agreed to pay taxes in countries where they managed to avoid doing that. But apart from double taxation issues, we also have to deal with what I would call double non-taxation. Transfer pricing rules that emerged in the 1960s have become more and more complex and sophisticated, with new methods introduced or new techniques used, although even they may not do justice to the appropriate taxation. So new suggestions have been voiced, new ideas have been put on the table, and many countries have already been relied upon rules. Russia is not with them, that may help address some of the issues and challenges. probably not all of them. The Russian Ministry of Finance, and I hope that some of you have heard about that, has come up with a new draft law amending the current tax codes on in three areas, which we believe are very important. One area is abuse of double tax laws, double tax treaties. These are usually bilateral treaties that prescribe who and when is to pay taxes in case of cross-border transactions, and who may be benefiting from certain tax preferences. But these treaties are, of course, pertain to the residents of these two negotiating states. But if one of them may have some transit or conduit vehicle established in one of these two, which is only there to transfer cash earned in one state to another, to the beneficiary owner of this earnings or revenues, there is certain concern that this entity can benefit from the double tax treaty. And it may be just a shell, this conduit or vehicle that is there to exploit the benefits and advantages of the double tax treaty. So we've introduced, or we've offered this new concept of beneficiary owner. And also, in case of such vehicles, conduit vehicles, we may put a certain barrier to their attempts at abusing. Well, I'm looking at my watch. My idea is to allow more time to the presenters, but there is another area which I wanted to discuss. Is tax residency, and it applies to corporates in this country, but in the national legislation it applies only to individuals, and there is no such a concept that applies to corporations. We actually deal with two categories. We talk about Russian or foreign organizations, as we call them, or corporations, companies, if you want. National legislation in Russia, we address the jurisdiction in which the corporation has been established, and it could have very serious legal implications. A Russian company is to pay taxes on their global revenues and earnings, while a foreign entity pays only taxes in Russia for profits or earnings raised in Russia. There's been some interference. Double tax treaties that the Russian Federation has so far had, so with exception of that with Japan that was inherited from the Soviet Union, relies on a different construction and allows and provides that tax residency rules can apply to corporates, and then foreign companies under certain circumstances, that is companies established in other jurisdiction, could be subject to national treatment. And of course, two issues are very pertinent here. Based on which criteria can we deal with the company that was established in a foreign jurisdiction, say Cyprus? I have nothing against Cyprus, it's just a popular jurisdiction. Can such companies be recognized as taxable or as tax residents in Russia? And whether Cyprus would agree to that, because Cyprus, I'm sure, would want also to consider this company to be their tax residents and pay relevant taxes to them, not to Russia. And this is a very complicated issue, and since it is part of the international law, or at least pertains to, its rules for defining tax residency are rather vague. And if you try to find in any national legislation some consistent algorithms and methods that would allow to judge about the affiliation with tax residency, this probably would be wrong. I have no examples. Much depends on very specific details, the area of business of the said company, how closely it is linked with this or other country. The basic criterion, as a rule, is the what we call effective management. And again, in various jurisdictions, there could be different concepts. There are two basic concepts: a strategic governance for management and day-to-day management. And of course, we need to decide here, to agree here. Our position is that we should stick to day-to-day management and day-to-day management decision making as a basic criterion or principle, and then this could serve as a basis for deciding which company is tax resident of Russia or not. But in every case, we probably would have to negotiate other countries whether we have a common understanding and interpretation for each and every country. This would require negotiations and certain agreements between the competent authorities. In Russia, this would be the Ministry of Finance. We're prepared to contribute to these negotiations. I don't think there will have to be many, at least at the initial stage. And lastly, what is important in this proposed draft law is the concept of the controlled foreign companies, which is even an even more complicated structure, which is dealt differently in different jurisdictions, and it may apply differently. Initially, we started with a very strict interpretation of the concept. I may be commenting more about the draft law, but there have been several iterations since involving this proposed draft law. We have had certain dialogue with the business community, and it's resulted in certain softening of the proposed draft. So the copy that you would find at our website is not the very final one. We only yesterday discussed some new amendments to the proposed draft, and some very important decisions were taken only yesterday by the minister. We haven't yet worded them. We need more time to think, but say in the most near future, probably before the end of the week, our new proposals will be worded, and we could then propose them something agreed upon with the other ministries and the business community. Should the cabinet support us, we will table that to the State Duma. It's our idea to have it approved by the State Duma this autumn, to come in effect on the 1st of February next year, which means it will be effectively applied with the 2016-2017 accounts, depending on various jurisdictions. Again, tax periods are not always January to January. It could be March or September or July of each year. we will take that all into account as well, not to add additional difficulties to taxpayers.
But if we start talking about basic constructs and all of the ways that we have to go through to develop it, then I can summarize it by saying that the ideology was rather simple. So in his address to the parliament, President Putin, at the end of last year, he said the following about offshore zones. He said, you can do business wherever you want, but you have to pay your taxes in Russia. So this was a very direct postulate. So if you think, of course, the ideology is quite clear. So if there are any funds that were made in Russia by a Russian tax resident or the resident for tax purposes were later transferred to an offshore or some other jurisdiction. Doesn't necessarily have to be an offshore jurisdiction. And then following that, it resulted in a business, or maybe it was included into a fund. Do excuse me for maybe not using the best terminology, but still, it generates taxes, generates profits, and then these profits are not taxed or taxed at much lower rates. Then can we say that the government, where the money originates in, has a right to have access to a part of profits? A lot of the governments confirm that. They say that, yes, of course, we also want to participate in taxation of these profits. This is what we hear from the United States, Great Britain, Canada, Germany, and the number of other countries, for instance, China, Kazakhstan, which already has this legislation. Unfortunately, we do not have this legislation yet. That's why we were never trying to access these profits, but that's what we're trying to do now. And then we have to deal with this issue: what sort of conditions will be there, which companies we're talking about, who will be acknowledged as the controlling entity, what sort of basis or foundation will we use to say whether we can tax profits and revenues that were generated outside of Russia, and of course, what sort of rules and what sort of tax rates will we use to pay taxes in Russia. What's also quite important is that we have to pay attention to administrative issues. How would the state get access to the information about controlled entities, and whether the governments would be able, using the tools available to its tax administrations, to actually tax the taxpayers who either act bona fide or do not act bona fide. But in the same time, how do we enforce the legislation, and how do we make them pay their taxes? So I think these are the key issues. I would also like to underline that each of these issues, when it comes to national legislation in different countries, then we can see that there are various approaches that are being implemented. In particular, the companies which are acknowledged as being controlled by foreign entities, we use three approaches: blacklists, whitelists, or we can use a definition of the effective tax rate. So when we talk about whitelists, it usually means that if a company was established in a whitelisted country, then we do not consider this company as a CFC. Blacklist, of course, this is the opposite. If the company is registered in a country which is on the blacklist, then in this case, again, this company would be an entity controlled in a foreign country. And the third option, which could probably be a more realistic one, is about the definition of effective tax rate. So what is an effective tax rate? Well, basically we have to define the volume of profits that the company generated over a year. We have to define the amount of taxation which was paid in the jurisdiction, in the relevant jurisdiction according to the national legislation, and of course the volume of tax, or the ratio between the tax and the revenue, would be an individual rate for each company. Why is this a more interesting instrument? Well, because when we talk about different jurisdictions, we're usually talking about a number, different preferences or tax breaks that are provided for different types of profits. For instance, a lot of countries say that we only tax profits which were made within our country, but all of the profits that are coming from other countries are not taxed. This is an extraterritorial principle of taxation. Some countries say that we do not tax dividends or interests that were generated from certain operations, and there are a lot of other nuances. And of course, any taxpayer, they can always hire professional lawyers and consultants, and usually they are aware about different opportunities. So of course, they will always choose the best or the most optimal jurisdiction. But if we're talking about an effective tax rate, then we don't not really have to deal with these problems. And another issue is which tax rate could be considered as high and which one as low. But when we're talking about a low tax rate, then the CFC company is a company when the tax rate is below a certain threshold. So what should be the threshold? We decided, or we proposed that it should be 3/4 of the Russian profit tax, so from 20%, so we're talking about 15%. And whether it is high or low, well, there are different points of views. We have had a lot of debate about this issue, and we've been told that in some countries the effective tax rate is set well, comparable to their national tax rate, say at the level of 75%, of 2/3, 55%, or even 50% in some countries. And in Germany, the effective tax rate is 25% of the national tax rate. Well, whether 3/4 is too high or too low, well, first of all, we have to compare this figure to the national tax rate, because if a tax rate in a country is set at 40%, then 50% of that 40% would be 20%. And of course, this is a much higher rate than the rate which exists in Russia. But if we look at British laws, where corporate tax rate is much higher than the corporate tax rate in Russia, then of course their effective tax rate would be 25.5%, 22.5%. That is why, if we talk about Russia from the UK's perspective, then this is a jurisdiction where the foreign control companies are established. Of course, I can give you a number of other examples, but we should always reach an agreement about the tax rates, and I think that our position, when they consider everything that has been said, is quite reasonable. Another issue is how do we define control, what is a foreign control entity, and who has an obligation to pay taxes. I'm really sorry, it took too much time, but maybe I was able to outline the topics for today's debate. But again, we have different approaches here. If we talk about Canada or Kazakhstan, these countries usually say if there is an entity who owns not less than 10% of the company's stock or the company's equity within an organization, which we will later acknowledge as a foreign controlled entity, then it should be enough. Then this entity is a controlling entity with all of the resulting obligations. Other countries they establish similar criteria, let's say 10%, but at the same time they say that another condition should be fulfilled. Our resident for our residents should own overall not less than 50% of the company's equity. Then we acknowledge it as control. And other countries said yet other rules, for instance, 25% in Portugal about control. So in Portugal, they say yes, if we see 25%, then we acknowledge it as such, and we do not even consider whether there are other Portuguese entities who are shareholders in the company. We think that it is sufficient so that we can ask what is the taxation base and what should be the taxation rates. We look at the profit of a corporation that was the profit of a corporation that was generated outside of the government. So also we also define surplus, profit surplus. We define the share of the shareholders. For instance, if I have 10%, that I pay 10% on the sum. And again, then they were asking to pay the taxes. So in any case, in Russia, the rates would be 13 or 20%. If we are talking about dividend income, then 9% is enough. As you can see, the tax rates are much lower than in a lot of countries who use similar mechanisms. Another important point that is also being discussed in great detail is that some countries say we do not really care what sort of income it is. We look at it as a whole, and then we calculate whether we tax it or not. Other countries believe that what's important is whether it's active or passive business activity. When we talk about active activity and active income, then usually we define it as non-passive. And when we talk about passive income, there is specific income such as interest, dividends, royalties, income from rent, marketing income, consulting income, and income from other different services. Of course, there are certain exceptions for certain types of operations and so on and so forth, but the rest is active business or active operations. But a lot of countries are saying that we're not interested in active operations, only the passive ones. I think this approach also has a right to insist. So we can say that the approaches are very different. Some countries say that we tax everything, other countries only tax passive income. But I think what we managed to do, I think we managed to find a compromise solution, albeit not a final one. When we're talking about passive income, then yes, we do tax it. This is a separate taxation base. But when we talk about active income, then we apply a set of very special rules. So we're trying to simplify the definition of a taxation base as much as possible. This is not a chapter 25 of a tax code. It has a very complicated structure, very complicated definition of income and expenditure, but we're talking about income and expenditure, which is defined in the national legislation. But when we talk about expenditure, we can talk about all sort of capex and investment expenditures, which would not at the same time undermine the business. So we write it off taxes. There is no depreciation, no special rules. It is just being deducted. So we can use any taxation base and actually transfer expenditures to future periods. So therefore, protect ourselves from any claims from the taxation authorities. And I think the last point that I want to make is whether the government is capable of administering it, of well, if you'd asked me 2 years ago, I would have said no. The government is not capable. I would have said that it is more in the realm of fantasy, probably is impossible to implement. But I can tell you that the situation is changing right now. First of all, we've entered into a number of treaties to avoid double taxation. The latest treaty, according to the last model convention, contains quite detailed provisions and legal norms about the exchange of information and interaction between tax authorities of different countries. And I think that in the nearest future, probably during the spring session, the State Duma will ratify a session of Russia to OECD when it comes to mutual support of tax administration and the collection of taxes, and usually it envisages different types of interactions between tax authorities of different countries. First and foremost is exchange of information through various channels and in various formats, then conducting joint audits and a number of other provisions. And what's of special interest here is that this convention has a norm according to which each country that signs the convention has an opportunity to state in which national territory this convention should be applied. What's interesting here is that the Netherlands and the UK, they made such announcements. Therefore, the convention is applied to all crown estates and all countries of the Commonwealth, and that's why most of the most popular Dutch and UK offshores will exchange information with Russia when Russia enters into the convention. They will also offer us support. Of course, I'm not an idealist. I clearly understand that we also have to run a number of reconciliation procedures about the format of information being exchanged, but nonetheless, we do have such opportunities. And again, since I made such an optimistic remark, let me conclude my presentation, my speech. And since we decided to ask all of the questions at the end of the session, right before lunch, then I think that I will give an opportunity to other speakers to deliver their presentations. And right now, I would like to ask Mr. Marco Graziani, who's a partner in Legans Avvocati Associati. Am I pronouncing it correctly? It's in Italian, as far as I understand. I'm sorry, I do not really know it that well, but I give you the floor now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for this invitation to attend the seminar. My Russian is still not very good, so I'll switch to English, and I apologize for that.
Switch to English now, and I think the chairman has already done a very good introduction. I have in my slide, I will very quickly touch upon some of the issues that he's mentioned. What I thought would have been interesting from a non-Russian side in this panel was to give you an overview of what is going on in other jurisdictions and what is happening and has happened in Italy also in particular, where we had similar issues to those that Russia is now trying to address some time ago. And probably I would like to give you also some example of how some of these rules in its implementation gave rise to some issues maybe or problems, and how one can think to tackle them also from a policy perspective and from an administration perspective. I don't know how can I move my slides, if there is anything you have. Is there a... Okay, just by way of background, when we deal with offshore jurisdictions and the financial offshore centers, we deal with sets of rules that potentially apply to two main categories of taxpayers that may have different needs, and they may need to be addressed in a different way. On one side, we have the businesses, and this is what, in particular, the chairman was talking about before. And then we have another set of rules and problems that come from high net worth individuals. I mean, they typically go offshore for holding their assets and for managing them offshore. According to some estimates, it's very difficult to have estimates in this field, but it seems that more than half of the world's private assets and investments are held in these offshore jurisdictions at the moment. And as the chairman said before, the reasons might be different. There is not necessarily tax evasion behind the use of these jurisdiction or aggressive tax planning. There could have been also commercial reasons linked to many different topics. For example, the need to invest in a specific jurisdiction where there could have been political issues or instability, the need to use a foreign law to regulate certain arrangements. So offshore is not necessarily bad. I mean, it's the use that has been done over time that has created problems to many countries, and is now creating the same type of problems also for countries such as Russia, such as China, India, and Brazil. The point is that the jurisdiction have realized that there was a huge loss of revenues. On the other side, it's not just this. We have experienced in past years that sometimes the lack of transparency and the lower level of regulation for certain activities, for example, in the financial sector, has also encouraged some situations that gave rise to the financial crisis, for example. On top of that, the lack of transparency is also a good way that has been favoring in the past illegal activities and money laundering. That's why if you put all these issues together, the response of the government was to tackle this problem in an effective way. And as the chairman was said, the OECD has been playing a very active role in this, in trying to coordinate the efforts at international level. The efforts are not just on the tax side. There have been also a lot of efforts on the financial regulation side, on the fight to money laundering. So different bodies at international level have been tackling offshore jurisdiction and try to push the various countries around the world to implement new standards and to push the governments of these offshore financial centers, of these tax havens, to enhance their legislation or to accept some different standards, for example, in terms of exchange of information. Going back to what I said, there are, a number of issues mainly for tackling the avoidance and the use of this jurisdiction by individuals, and there are other for businesses. If we look at the individuals, and here there have been different routes pursued that are going in the same direction. Probably the big change of the last, I would say, 10 years is the enhancement in the exchange of information, which was traditionally done by bilateral tax treaties, but we're going more and more for a multilateral approach that the OECD has been favoring a lot. But if we look, for example, also at the European Union, the European Union in this field implemented a very effective automatic exchange of information. This is, I don't know if you're familiar with the EU system, there is a savings directive that provides that member states need to automatically exchange information about financial investments. I'm using this in general terms. There were a number of loopholes there because many situations did not fall within the rules, and there were also exemptions for the countries that in Europe still had bank secrecy, Luxembourg and Austria and Belgium. The rules have been amended, and starting from 2016, a new version of the Savings Directive will enter into force, where all these loopholes have been closed. So exchange of information will be very effectively, and bank secrecy can no longer be opposed in Italy, in Europe, everywhere in the European Union. This is the same type of approach that the OECD is trying to push for. Obviously, within the European Union, when a directive is implemented, it is automatically a requirement for the member states to adopt this legislation. For the other countries that are members of the OECD, this needs to be agreed on a case-by-case basis, even on a multilateral basis. But the news are that this is no longer exchange of information on request. There's going to be more and more automatic exchange of information. And it is something very new that, I mean, not just 1 month ago, many countries, not just the OECD members, but also other countries, agreed on a common standard. This is what the chairman was saying before. It is very important to agree what is the format of the information being exchanged. And this is going to happen potentially. The USA have taken their own route, as they often did in the past, also when they started to tackle these problems. FATCA theoretically goes in a similar direction, but obviously, probably the OECD approach is welcomed because it sets a standard that has to be agreed by everyone. You cannot impose your standards on other countries, as the US are doing, and many countries have accepted to sign intergovernmental agreements with the USA. But certainly it's the OECD that potentially can change the system in this respect with some common measures. This is going to impact a lot in the future, especially for the taxation of individuals and for those that are using offshore jurisdictions to own their assets. Together with these, there are other key measures that are having an impact on this. The presumption, for example, many countries introduced a presumption of fraud for those that own assets abroad that are not disclosed to their own tax authorities. We do have this provision also in Italy, for example, if the tax authorities found that someone has assets abroad and that have not been declared, there's an extension of the statute of limitation for assessments, and very likely there are also criminal implications for this. Together with this, the level of compliance and on banks and even on professionals, on lawyers, on tax advisors, has increased a lot. This is also a big change. This is a big change if you put this together with the relaxation of bank secrecy on one side, with more stronger measures on anti-money laundering checks that banks, financial institutions, even professionals have to make. And a new trend potentially in the near future will be, it's already starting at the moment, even in Italy, that tax authorities will have more and more access also to information that have been gathered for anti-money laundering purposes. This is very powerful because the powers of the tax authorities sometimes are limited. But if they can be extended, if they can gather information that financial institutions, lawyers, or accountants gather for KYC purposes, for anti-money laundering purposes, they will have access to much more information than before. That's why in many European jurisdictions, but also outside of Europe, in Canada, Australia, and in the US, there have been voluntary disclosure programs opened for those individuals that want to regularize their situation. They want to say to their tax authorities, I'm coming back with the assets, or I'm declaring my assets abroad. The point is that the situation, I mean, we will touch upon the situation for businesses, but for individuals, I think we are in a much more advanced stage at the moment in fighting against offshore jurisdictions, especially in certain jurisdictions. I have clients, I mean, the point is that FATCA on one side and the relaxation of bank secrecy is pushing many financial institutions around the world to not to accept any more clients that are not that have not disclosed their situation to their tax authorities. I have clients that have received letters from Swiss banks, for example, where the Swiss bank says, if you don't communicate to us that by this date, which potentially is this year, you have regularized your situation with the tax authorities in Italy, in some cases they will automatically exchange the information for the future. In other cases, they will close the accounts immediately at a certain point. Some banks have even wrote in a letter that they're going to send a check to the client at home if he does not communicate anything by a certain date. So this is proving extremely effective. And that's why, I mean, these voluntary disclosure program at the moment have been implemented. They are a bit different from tax amnesties that we had in the past that could have been done on an anonymous basis. Voluntary disclosure programs are not anonymous. The taxpayer has to disclose his assets. He gets a discount on taxes and penalties, and potentially he may avoid criminal implications. That's why I think I wanted to mention this, because for individuals, we are at a stage which is very advanced at this moment in some countries for fighting against these offshore jurisdictions. If we move to businesses, we have already mentioned what are the key points here that are those that are being tackled by Russia at the moment. Exchange of information is also in this area a crucial measure. Then there are a number of specific anti-abuse rules. We will see them in a moment. I mean, CFC rules, residence attraction rules, as the chairman mentioned. There are rules on limitation on deductibility of certain expenses if there are payments to entities in an offshore jurisdiction. Or sometimes if there's not a limitation to the deductibility, there is at least a disclosure requirement. So if a business has to specifically disclose in its tax return that it's paying a certain amount to entities that are in an offshore jurisdiction, this is a good indication for the tax authorities when they make an audit to double check whether this is a true payment or whether it is hiding something. And then there is the last point that I will mention at the end of my presentation, transfer pricing, because transfer pricing to us at the moment that we have seen this development in the last 10 years seems to be the more powerful tool for tax authorities, at least in certain countries. Let me make a few examples that are in line with what the chairman said before. Italy had exactly the same issues. Many Italian businesses had set up companies outside of Italy. They still have many. For Italy, while for Russia, Cyprus is popular, for Italy it was Luxembourg or the Netherlands. Holding companies, IP, holding companies for intangibles, these were very common at the end of the 90s and at the beginning of this century. Now, what happened? At some point, without new rules, but the Italian authorities started to apply our domestic rules for residents, which are in line with the concept of place of management. And that started to make challenges. I mentioned there a very big case that was one of the first ones. It was against a company called Bell. Bell was a company that when Telecom Italia was privatized, a number of Italian shareholders, together with some other parties that financed this, they bought Telecom Italia in 1999 through this Luxembourg holding company. They sold Telecom Italia 2 years after, and they made a huge capital gain, more than 2 billion. Now, after a few years, the tax authorities started an investigation on this. And they started it, as it often happens in Italy, not just under administrative law, but under criminal law. Because potentially, if you exceed a certain threshold, it is a criminal offense to evade taxes. The powers were very large for the auditors, for the Italian tax police. They collected plenty of information. What they did mainly, they went to the lawyers. They went to Freshfield's office in Milan. They seized all the documents. They seized the computers of the lawyers that had been working on the deal. And they found plenty of evidence that the company, although it was a Luxembourg company, it was effectively managed from Italy. The lawyers in Italy, in Milan, were preparing the shareholders board and the board resolutions for the company. And there were many other indications and documents, and they were building a case against this company. The request was quite substantial. I mean, they requested something, 1.6 billion in taxes and penalties. The case then continued. It was a very important case, and at some point it was settled for a lower amount, but they decided to settle this. But this is an example of many others. There have been many cases like this. The problem, what is the problem, is that at some point, when the tax authorities are, let's say, forced to some extent to use these rules, you get to situations where there is uncertainty about how these rules can be effectively applied in many situations. So, for example, I am looking at some cases at the moment where they are applying the same concept to some investment funds set up outside of Italy where there were Italian managers involved. But this is a totally different situation, because in these investment funds, there are funds from international investors. So these type of investigations now are creating a problem for the economy, because international investors are scared about putting their monies in structures that can be challenged. So the message is that it's effectively, as the chairman said, it's very difficult when you get to apply these rules. But you always have to be careful, because there is a point where you risk to discourage foreign investments. And there is another example. I will make another example here. At some point, Italy introduced specific rules on CFCs, for example. To give an example, we started with a rule in 2000 with just a blacklist and the notion of control, which was more than 50% at the time. Then the rules have been amended. Now CFC rules can be applied if there is a blacklist entity involved, also if the shareholding is 20% or more. But we have extended the rules to have also to whitelisted countries. So if the effective tax rate is below 50% of the Italian tax rate, which would mean the Italian tax rate is 27.5. So if the rate is below 14%, potentially, and if the company established in a whitelist jurisdiction or even in Europe, for example, IP companies in Luxembourg potentially fall within our CFC rules because they receive passive income. The problem is that these rules are very complex and are very difficult to apply, and that's why the Italian tax authorities at the moment are not really looking at enforcing the CFC rules in audits, but they are directly going to apply transfer pricing concept to this, and I will come to this in a moment. They also introduced some specific presumptions for residents. So as I said, we had the test is already in our legislation, that if a company is effectively managed from Italy, it can be treated as Italian resident. But the burden of proof is on the authorities in this case. They introduced, the parliament introduced some specific rules with presumptions. So if a company, for example, is outside of Italy, but it controls an Italian entity, and in turn, it is either controlled by Italy or it is managed by a board where the majority are Italian residents, there is an automatic presumption that this foreign company can be treated as resident in Italy. And these presumptions have been introduced not just for companies, but also for trusts, structures, for example. And as I said, the challenges are continuing. We had, probably you may have heard, I mentioned one of the most recent, Dolce & Gabbana, the luxury brand. They made a transaction a few years ago where they moved their IP, the brand, to Luxembourg. They have been challenged by the tax authorities on two different grounds. One was the value of the brand when it was sold by the two individuals. And the other challenge is on the residence of the Luxembourg company that owns the brand. And there were a lot of discussions and court decisions. In the last court decision, it's not the final one yet, but Mr. Dolce and Mr. Gabbana has been sentenced to 18 months of prison for this, and also to pay more than 350 million of taxes. And incidentally, also the advisors have been involved in the criminal case. Now, another example, which is along the lines that the chairman mentioned at the beginning of the concept of beneficial ownership. So potentially treaty abuse is the use of foreign finance companies. Again, here it is a bit tricky because finance companies abroad have been used by Italian groups in most cases not to avoid taxes, but simply to have more efficient structures for raising money in the international financial market. The problem is that when a foreign company, a finance company, raises money, issues a bond, for example, to the market, it has then to lend this money back to the Italian group. And this loan is potentially subject to withholding tax. Now, we have had many cases on this and many challenges. There are huge files at the in the tax authority's office against these a number of Italian groups. They are realized now that potentially this was not a good case for the economy in general, because you could obviously enforce this concept of beneficial ownership. But the news, for example, of yesterday, the new government in Italy has proposed to introduce an exemption on a number of finance transactions to allow Italian company to have efficient financing structures. So here probably the message here is it is good to have a beneficial ownership clause to prevent effectively a number of abuses of the tax treaties, conduit structures, but when the ultimate goal is effectively or can benefit the economy of the country because it can bring foreign investments through the capital markets, for example, it would be a good thing at some point to have even a domestic exemption for the interest income paid to foreign financial institutions or to foreign investors, because this may bring money in the countries that can be invested in infrastructures or in developing the businesses. So this is just to give you an overview. I mean, another area, just to mention it, is the area of permanent establishment. The chairman also mentioned this. Italy has been very aggressive, Italy, but also other European countries, are being very aggressive in looking at the concept of permanent establishment for some businesses that operate in our countries. Banks, for example, in Italy, foreign banks have been targeted because typically banks, they leave very little money in the countries. They operate 2 branches. And there have been a number of challenges against them. But at the moment, the big challenges are on the new economy, for example, on the digital companies, IT companies, because it's very difficult to identify a permanent establishment there, but there is a huge turnover that is generated by these companies. And this is an example. I think this is from the UK. I took it somewhere, but it gives you an idea. So if you see in green, you have the turnover that is generated by some important companies. You see McDonald's, Google, Starbucks, and Amazon, and Apple. And when you look at and Facebook also, if you look, the others are there's turnover in green, then in blue, if my recollection is correct, should be the P&L result. And then you have in black the taxable base, and in red, taxes paid in the local country. So you see that there are a lot of differences. There are companies that generate a huge turnover, potentially huge profits also in a country, but pay very little taxes there. And this is common in many European jurisdictions at the moment. And the tax authorities have been scrutinizing deeply these situations. Permanent establishment is one of the tools that they are using to challenge the presence in the country of these entities. For example, Amazon has been investigated in Italy because they claim that what they have in Italy is just a warehouse where they don't perform any relevant and significant activity. It's just an auxiliary activity, having a warehouse there. The contract, if you buy something in Amazon, is with Luxembourg or with another company somewhere else in Europe. And they just ship to you what you're buying in Amazon. And so they pay very, very little taxes, although they may employ hundreds of people in Italy in these warehouses. And that's why the European Union decided to start quite a lot of time ago, in the 90s, to look at internally. European is a unified market, but still there is some competitions, obviously, between the states. They were trying to identify this, and I'm very close to finish my presentation, but here what I wanted to highlight is very new. Last week, there were challenges raised against Apple, Starbucks, and Fiat Finance, a finance company of Fiat. these were raised by the European Commission on the grounds that potentially they want to investigate whether some rulings granted on transfer pricing by Ireland, the Netherlands and Luxembourg may amount to a state aid. I don't know if you're familiar with the European Union rules, but why the Commission is claiming that this can be a state aid, the reason is very simple. Income taxes are not harmonized, and the power of the European Union in income taxes is very limited. But if they look at state aid rules, they are very powerful. The Commission is the prosecutor and the judge at the same time. Then obviously there are the European courts that can review the situation. But it's extremely powerful what they can do, and they can also impose to a state to recover the benefit from the business. So the OECD, I will not discuss this in any detail because the chairman already mentioned this is the big development for next years to come, the base erosion and profit shifting project at the OECD, which tackles all that we've been mentioning so far. There are 15 actions that go from exchange of information to transfer pricing to enhanced transparency and so on. So, and this is my last slide. I mean, what is going on at the moment? On top of those rules that we've mentioned, beneficial ownership clauses, treaty abuse, exchange of information, at the moment, the focus on many countries is really on transfer pricing, because it's a much more powerful tool to identify or to try to set some criteria, which are extremely difficult to be set, of how to allocate revenues, to split revenues, and to allocate them to a specific jurisdiction. The businesses have here a possibility to cooperate with the tax authorities and to make advanced pricing agreements. In Italy, we have introduced a few years ago also an APA program, and it's proving to be extremely successful. It's a way of sitting with the tax authorities, agreeing on what is going to be your taxable base, and avoiding potential challenging from the authorities. And the last, again, in a compliant approach is the cooperative compliance programs that probably, as the chairman was saying at the beginning, this is a way that can allow businesses to talk to the tax authorities and to discuss in practice how to take this forward. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marco. Well, when I was listening to your presentation, I thought, well, there are a lot of similarities, and the challenges that we are facing could be quite the same. Of course, in some ways, Italy is more advanced and we're a bit lagging behind. Of course, it's going to take some time for us to implement this, and we cannot just leap into the future. But in any case, I realize that we have to move in this direction, and it is absolutely clear. I also mentioned in my speech that offshore jurisdictions, first we were not really paying much attention to them, then we sort of put up with them, but lately the situation started to change quite drastically. So why is it happening? I think that's firstly because all of the measures, all of the funds that are accumulated in offshore jurisdictions or are managed through offshore jurisdictions are quite significant. Of course, nobody really was able to count it, but the experts say that it's up to $20 trillion. This is a lot of money, and it is becoming more significant from a political point of view. and of course it creates certain concerns, but I think also the financial slowdown and the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 played a big role. And what's also important, aggressive policy of a lot of large international companies, and these, what Marco mentioned, like Google or Starbucks and other. These are not the only examples, I have to say, but a lot of other large international companies demonstrated quite an astonishing degree of cynicism by not paying taxes and by actually using all of the possibilities, all of the gaps in international legislations. Of course, we know that these gaps will continue to exist, but it's understandable because the business has access to the best lawyers, to the best consultants, to trailblazers who can always discover different ways to minimize taxation. And of course, all of the governments will always lag behind these professionals. That's why today we are discussing cooperation between tax authorities and large corporations. But I have to say that the problem is not just companies, these multinational companies are trying to save money on taxes, but it also results in another effect, which is extremely annoying to a lot of national governments, because companies who pay such low taxes, what they're basically promoting is unfair competition, because small and medium-sized enterprises who operate within national jurisdictions, they do not have such opportunities to minimize taxations as opportunities utilized by large multinational companies. That is why if any government or any nation puts up with this state of things, this state of affairs, then of course it damages the development of its economy, the development of national businesses. What's also important, another detail that Marco has mentioned, is, of course, a lot of the problems that are related to us lagging behind are also connected to the notion that transfer pricing has to be changed. And the example that Marco gave us about the warehouse, which is actually a center of economic activity and which generates the most profit, I think this is the classic case of the transfer of profits to the most convenient jurisdiction. And of course, I have to say that today there are a lot of instruments that allow this to happen. For instance, when we're talking about transfer of profit, there are a lot of problems that are generated with IP. So when we're talking about IP and IP rights, and these rights being given to companies in low tax jurisdictions, then it gives them an opportunity to transfer loyalty payments there for the usage of brands and so on.
While doing your funding out of this kind of center, you could allege that the companies assume most of the risks, and one would argue that this warehouse is exactly the center which makes funding available, which assumes all the risks, while other entities involved are just operators, and they carry minimum of risks and probably should not be allocated any profits earnings earned by the multinational corporation. There's yet another thing that is left ignored, which is e-trading, internet trading. The OECD surfaced this issue as something, as an item on its future agenda. Sales of Amazon and the likes that sell and deliver goods all across the world. But all taxes are concentrated in one jurisdiction, and this triggers quite justified doubts whether it is appropriate. This issue is yet discussed and nothing has been done actually. But the idea was to uh, tax at the location of delivery, destination location. This may well become reality in the near future. Approaches are changing, rules are being changed, the governments are cooperating more and more together with each other by coming up with new rules and standards. This is the new reality that will become our current reality more and more, and I think the business should be prepared to accept it. Thank you very much. It seems to happen that we have had only male speakers so far, and we still are to have Mr. Pahomov. He is from the General Council Department of Interrao in Russia, and I'm sure he will tell us about the ways Interrao is exploiting to avoid taxation. Our laws also deal with transfer pricing and tax policies, apart from many other things. Thank you very much for saying that Cyprus was popular as an offshore jurisdiction in Russia. It's actually a popular Russian jurisdiction, if you want. And I wanted to talk of the perception by the business community of the most recent developments promoted by the Ministry of Finance and the Russian government in general. Our perception of de-offshorization is that it should not be a separate, isolated element. It should be part and parcel of the national policies to promote Russian economy as an attractive location for foreign investments. And in that respect, we entertain hopes that the Russian government will resort to a whole set and system of measures that would accompany the de-offshorization and nationalization of business taxation. Is the government sorry, as a company with the government interests, we are very much in favor and we benefit from de-offshorization. We feel quite comfortable, particularly in the context of the most recent political developments and the risk of expropriation and denationalization and the most recent sanctions threatened by the US and the European countries because it involves title risks. However, the company that pursues business for profit generation purposes, we realize that national elements of taxation and tax policies may be of significant effect for the possibility and prospects of developing assets in Russia and exploiting Russian-based profit centers or income centers. The tax policy is probably the crucial element as well as the criterion for determining where you want to pursue your business. We have we see three important elements of tax policy, which is, of course, the the ones that I showed here. We have been doing our horizontal monitoring. Last year, we signed a settlement agreement with the tax authority. The very first one we signed at the Economic Court of Russia, but we are collaborating with the Russian tax authority. We get their rulings on various tax issues pertaining to our business transactions, and we believe this is a very positive trend for ourselves. It's only natural for me to point out that in our recent dealings with the tax authorities, we managed to achieve quite a lot of reversals by the higher levels of authority in the tax service. They seem to be more thorough, more reasonable now in their rulings. If I'm to comment on the most recent legal drafts, law drafts promoted by various ministries, I might only reiterate some of the issues that Mr. Shatalov pointed out, in particular the concept of the CFCs. And what I want to underscore is that this draft law is affecting interests of the real economy business. We have got some new comments as to the criteria for recognizing CFCs. Our company has been working under many international contracts. We have different splits of interests and various projects, and sometimes it is parity, 50-50 participation with our foreign partners, and the low threshold of 10% for this company is not deemed appropriate, and we will be fighting against this very low threshold. As to the application of Chapter 25 of the Russian tax codes, we have some issues with the applicable methodology of the cost deductions, and the previous speakers, of course, all mentioned that transfer pricing, and it is an issue which mechanism of transfer pricing will be used to calculate the taxable earnings. And of course, there is this issue of very broad interpretation of certain rules of this new law on controlling foreign companies. As to those lists, white or black lists, or whether this effective tax rate and how it is to be calculated. I would argue that at the first stage, a list would do better. This is more transparent for business because the calculation of the effective tax rate follows certain very complicated methodology. It should be objective, of course, unbiased. Well, of course, this is arguable, but this is my opinion. We could move on later to the concept of the effective tax rate after we're comfortable with certain mechanisms, after we have covered certain roads, and we have direct understanding of all pluses and minuses of the application and implementation of that new law. Further on, this de-offshorization hinges not only on the industry-specific taxation. There is a whole set of tax rules that would affect the attractiveness of Russia as a tax jurisdiction. amendments to many corresponding rules of tax legislation may have a certain economic effects where Russia would be gaining in terms of redirecting business flows back to Russia. And as far as the law on controlling foreign companies is concerned, and if one of the criteria is a certain availability of certain agreement on information exchange, our issue here is whether it is enough to have the specific paragraph in the double tax treaty with the Netherlands, and whether the specific paragraph that covers information is sufficient, or we need to have a separate agreement with the relevant country on specific information exchange. I wonder if it will be enough also if this country joins this convention on exchanges. Will it be enough for us to be not to be considered a CFC if we're established in a country with whom we have this convention signed or agreements signed? It's important that this sort of agreements are drafted and signed as soon as possible, I would argue. It is also quite essential that, and of course, it is impossible to fully exclude, but it's important for us to be less dependent on foreign institutions, payment systems. You have heard about the most recent problems with Visa and MasterCard, and then again the US law FATCA to come into effect as of the 1st of July. That all created very painful concerns about the fact that the national economy in this country is very seriously dependent on other jurisdiction. Of course, the whole thing should be treated from the point of view of making this country more attractive as a jurisdiction. This is an issue which is not restricted to taxes. Making our corporate legislation attractive is something we have been talking about and joined in this discussion by financiers and businessmen. It is also quite important to attract more joint ventures to Russia. In the Netherlands, they tax corporate income at a rate of 25, individual income is 50. We still continue to use the Netherlands because our foreign partners insist on that, because they offer certain preferences on financial transactions, and we are forced to. We can't conclude shareholders' agreements under the Russian law in the absence of certain safeguards or a system of safeguards and liabilities. In this approach, on this concept, we have no arguments against changing the jurisdiction of incorporation. As to the efficient tax administration and collaboration with taxpayers is something I've covered. As for preferences to be offered and a grace period to be offered to allow businesses to move their operations to Russia, something I've been discussing in the business community. If we're changing the rules of law here and there, let us provide with certain grace periods, 1 or 2 years, whereby we'll be offered preferential tax rates or a kind of a tax amnesty. We can't just move from today on because certain foreign liabilities that we need to suffer, we need to respond to. Just to give you an example, in the Russian Federation, we have 6 airplanes used. They all are registered abroad. The owners want to re-register their airplanes, aircraft in the Russian Federation. The business aviation has zero rate for most of the planes, but these 6 pieces of aircraft is subject to 17%. Why not allow them a better preference? If not a zero rate, it at least could be slightly less than the current 17 and a half. Of course, we have a whole set of rules that affect the nationalization of business. But in fact, these specific aircraft can only be operated by certified pilots, and they are all foreign, and we are not allowed to hire foreign pilots under the current law. We are looking forward to certain resolutions of the government for this specific business case. This is just an example of how we should correlate both our business decisions. So as Inter-RAO is concerned, we have 46 companies in 15 countries, in which we have a share larger than 1%. So we, as a result, have more than 90% CFCs. They are mostly production companies, generating companies, operating companies. 3% are foreign service companies and 7% holding companies. I have already mentioned that we have some serious issues with this criteria of foreign interest, foreign equity at 50%, for example, in the United States. This is the criterion of assets to be owned by the residents. Well, I mentioned this issue. Let me also give you some specific example of moving offshore. This is an example of our Georgian assets held through a holding company in the Netherlands. This Georgian business was acquired with funds, the loans mobilized from an international bank, which was cheaper than getting it from a Russian bank. There's no double tax treaty between Russia and Georgia. For your information, this asset in Georgia is at the state of rehabilitation. You can't expect much in terms of dividends, but we are still to repay the loan to foreign banks, and the existing scheme as it is to transfer dividend profits and some other to the Dutch-based holding company to repay the loans. So if we are to nationalize it all, the withholding tax in Georgia is 5 to 10%. Any interest payments or dividend payments leave Georgia with 5%, 10% management services. So the company, thanks to what it's because of the changes, would lose up to 10% of the amount they need to repay the loans. Dividends are taxed in Russia at 9%, but this is a particular case because there's no double tax treaty. So our proposal is to be more active in getting double tax treaties like countries.
Well, to conclude my speech, I want to say that failure to pay tax, well, we will unfortunately never resolve this problem, but it shouldn't be the problem of the government, but it is probably the issue with for the individuals and the legal entities which have to be changed through legislation. Thank you very much, Alexander, for an interesting presentation and talking about the last example that you mentioned. So, what did you say? From 5 to 10%, and who will acquire it? Well, the Georgian government. The Georgian government. Because this is withholding tax. Okay, now it's clear. And another consideration I would like to underline, then, when we are considering the alternative for the transfer of business into Russia, I think this is not what we require. We usually say do your business as you wish, but given certain conditions, we would like to have a right for taxation when it comes to the Netherlands. I think this is one of the most popular jurisdictions, as you understand. That's why I really understand why your shareholders are not in a rush to leave Holland. Of course, unfortunately, I don't have enough time to talk about it, but you know the double Dutch Irish sandwich, this is a well-known scheme. Unfortunately, we do not have sandwiches. We're not McDonald's. But no, I'm sorry, this is not the sandwich that you can eat, but this is the name of the scheme which they came up with. It's a very complicated, but at the same time extremely beautiful scheme that allowed to use both Irish and Dutch legislations, as well as specific features of these legislations, so that you can have closed systems to structure your income in such a way where you do not really have to pay tax. Well, I can tell you that intra-group borrowing was more than the overall budget of Georgia. Well, the last commentary. I want to underline one more time that we really work in close cooperation with businesses. We have a lot of discussions with businesses, so the business community understands that the trend is there, that the laws will be introduced in Russia as well. But of course, we understand that the businesses want to ensure more favorable conditions, probably, step-by-step implementation, some additional preferences and benefits to make it easier for them to adapt. That's what we understand. That's why we're looking for stage-by-stage implementation, for gradual implementation. We shouldn't introduce it as so-called shock treatments. It would be dangerous. But since we don't have much time, taxation is an important issue, but we should never be late for lunch. So let me give the floor to Norilsk Nikil, Елена Безденежных. Well, thank you very much. I was invited to, to talk against the nationalism, for de-offshorization. I think my colleague was for it, but since I only have limited time, I should say that 5 minutes should be enough for me. So I would like to say that any healthy business in Russia, such as Norilsk Nickel or any other large holdings, of course, first and foremost, we would like the Russian economy to grow, because this is the environment where we function. Unfortunately, I do not have any slides, but we have, again, more than 100 legal entities, and I would say that some of these entities are registered in different jurisdictions all over the world. Of course, some of these entities were inherited. Some we acquired through M&A deals. There were American companies, European companies, and offshore structures. So again, if we want to restructure these companies, it will not take 2 years, as my colleagues have mentioned, but actually a much longer longer time because we cannot restructure this corporate organization in 2 years. That's why for us, I think what's important during the transfer period length was extremely important for us. Yeah, we do have the RSPP platform, so we were able to give our feedback, and I think that yesterday we had a very productive dialogue, which resolved some of the concerns of the business community, but I think a number of concerns still remains, and they're quite important. When we are talking about taxation, it's not information disclosure and low taxation regime. It's not that important for us, but when we talk about the disclosure of information about beneficiaries or low tax rate, that's not that important. What's important for us is to split the risks, to have actual protection of our assets, and so that we have a very transparent, very understandable, and very open mechanisms that would allow us to attract investment. Of course, corporate legislation in Russia, of course, is lagging. Corporate legislation is lagging behind all of the novellas that the Ministry of Finance is going to introduce by the end of this year. But again, we will not change the corporate law. We won't manage to change the corporate law until then. So how are we going to function in this transitional period? Of course, we'll have to find new ways. We'll have to come up with certain schemes, even though they're unpopular. But again, this is something that we have to need. So setting the threshold of participation in a foreign company, it has been agreed 50% plus one. Again, 3 million rubles this is the threshold for the taxated income. Tax amnesty was only approved as a concept without any specific measures or the steps that would allow to establish tax amnesty for the businesses that do not restructure within the certain time. And of course, the questions for discussion that still remains is that we have to increase the thresholds of participation in a foreign company. We asked it to be raised to 50%. Otherwise, a huge volume of information that the tax authorities will have to process, even though we were given all assurances that tax authorities do have departments and capabilities to process such a huge volume of information. But we believe that this is not the case. And then again, we offered to start with individuals and only then move to organizations. There was another proposal that hasn't found support in the government. Decrease of the effective tax rate limitation for the CFC companies down to 1% of the income tax rates. Again, this proposal hasn't found support. To define the states, the so-called white and black lists, first of all, we were talking about blacklists, now we're talking about the white list, and right now we're talking about effective tax rate. Again, this is a very debatable issue that creates a lot of contention. Then taxation base just for the passive assets, that's again one more thing that hasn't been approved. We are still saying that passive income hasn't been defined yet and hasn't been designated as a separate thing from active income. And another thing is setting special rules for retained earnings of foreign companies and no taxation of this income. Again, hasn't found support. Another thing that we actually never presented for discussion is reinvestment of profits. So if big holding companies like Norilsk Nickel, if we reinvest our income that was generated in offshore jurisdictions back into our production activity, again, we gave a lot of arguments. We were assured that these arguments will be taken into account, but I think reinvestments into Russian economy will actually really spur the development of the economy. Thank you you very much. I would like to thank Yelena, and I think that all of us can agree that there is a lot of interest to this topic. This topic is going through a lot of lively discussions, and of course, if we start looking at it in depth, there are a lot of nuances and there are a lot of specific features, even though sometimes they're quite unexpected. In our initial discussion, we did talk about white and black lists. So why did we deviate from this idea? Well, first and foremost, because you saw how many ambassadors of foreign countries came to me when they found out that these lists will be introduced. And I think these ambassadors will also go to the governments. They will use different diplomatic channels of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs so that they're not included into either of the lists. And again, here we have to mention a significant issue which would, strange though it might seem, influence taxation. But still, I want to say that the new rules will actually make us review and revise a lot of things. We know that the tax law has really progressed far along, especially when compared to civil law. Unfortunately, as Ministry of Finance, we cannot work on civil legislation, but of course we have to take it into account. It's like, being a big fleet, we shouldn't probably look at the last and the slowest ship, but still we have to think how we can adapt to the system. The only thing that I can say for sure when it comes to consultants and to lawyers, they will never be out of work, at least in the near future. That's why I think now is the time to give the floor to consultants and auditors from KPMG. It's a very well-known auditing company, and I give the floor to Irina Narisheva, head of legal in Russia and the CIS. So Irina, please keep in mind they don't have much time, maybe 10 minutes, not more if you can. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. It's really hard to be the last speaker because everybody is probably already tired. So let me underline that I'm a lawyer. I'm not a tax consultant, but I wanted to share my observation when it comes to the implementation of a number of projects that are related to de-offshorization, and we have been working with a lot of consultants. We saw a lot of measures from the business community and how they treat different legislative initiatives. So I would like to tell Mr. Shatalov that we had a business case when we told clients that for them de-offshorization will actually be a very good thing, which would increase the efficiency of their corporate governance. So I will not go into a lot of detail. You probably know about the key initiatives related to de-offshorization. The only thing I want to mention that apart from taxation initiatives, we are also discussing the anti-money laundering law, especially when it comes to the participation in government tender procedures and bidding procedures for offshore companies. This is a very important trend. This is related to the de-offshorization policy. When we talk about corporate governance, I think a lot of questions that we hear are related to the initiative about tax residency of companies. And in the latest version of the law, please correct me, Mr. Shatalov, if I'm wrong, but it says that the criteria which will be used to determine the location of the company for tax purposes will be number one, where the board of directors or shareholders meetings are held, whether they're held in the Russian Federation. Then again, governance or management of the company from the Russian Federation, and the activity of the management in the Russian Federation. So these criteria of course, true for several countries because, of course, we know that the board of directors meetings can be held in Russia, in Cyprus, or somewhere else. There'll be additional criteria, how we determine where the accounting is done, where the assets are stored, and where the most decrees are signed. So there are two questions that a lot of people have been asking. What do we consider the management or managerial governments? For instance, we have two concepts. One is the Swiss concept, another is the concept of strategic management, which is accepted in the UK. So I think it was very good for us to hear that the Ministry of Finance believes in the day-to-day management concepts, because right now we're working on one of the projects which is related to restructuring of a large oil company, and they ask us, what if we go to Cyprus, say, once every 3 months, would that be enough or not? But then again, it was hard for us to answer this. Law enforcement practice also will provide us with a clearer picture. And I think another question relates to the fact how these criteria should be applied. Because when we talk about the first draft legislation, we were saying that it should be just one of the criteria. If one of the criteria is applied, then we can acknowledge the company as being resident for tax purposes. Now they removed this provision, but it doesn't still say whether they should all be applied simultaneously. So the issue is still open. Maybe we'll hear somebody's comments about it today. But what is business doing today? Well, they've started to introduce measures to protect their structures, and I think this is a very useful exercise, not just to evaluate taxation risks, but also when it comes to so-called, internal or domestic economy. We were looking at a production group which included 150 companies, foreign assets, foreign businesses, and actually the owners of the companies, they couldn't answer the question why do they need 15 foreign companies. The structure of the holding was very chaotic. They opened new businesses, new operations. They were creating legal entities to conduct these operations, and then we run into the issue that they become managed companies. That's why it's very important to realize operational activity, the flow of assets, where IP is registered, how the intragroup borrowings are structured, and whether the presence in the foreign jurisdictions is sufficient. As we mentioned several times today, the drivers for the creation of international structures are not always the efficiency or optimization of taxation. And quite a large part of foreign structures were created because foreign capital insisted on using UK law or on signing shareholders' agreements, and they do not trust legal practice, legal proceedings in Russia. So one of the examples that we looked at when we were talking about restructuring of business was that we actually told the company that you can satisfy the De-offshorization criteria, while at the same time you can manage your company according to the UK legislation. So the group of the companies included a lot of foreign funds and portfolio investors who are interested in generating profit when it comes to the sales of their assets or the sales of their stock. So the holding company was created in Cyprus. It includes several sub-holding companies, so which manage certain business operations. They also have operational companies and a separate foreign assets. So our task was that we had to maintain tax optimization and tax efficiency of the group, while at the same time define which risks appear due to taxation trends, since a lot of managers of the company are Russian residents. The company is not ready to shift its decision-making power to the nominal directors in Cyprus. The decisions are made quite frequently, and that is why we need to make it comfortable for them when it comes to corporate governance.
It is always of principal importance to retain our shareholders' agreement. It is very complex. We had a lot of shareholders, and we were very averse to the idea of amending it. Our group didn't have any revenues in form of royalty, and we didn't have much in terms of group debt. We had some debts raised externally, and as part of our restructuring, we also needed to make sure that our covenants are retained. It was decided to consider several options of restructuring, and one of the extreme cases would be to retain the same structure, but then we would need a lot to be done to ensure presence in foreign jurisdiction in Cyprus. The conclusion was that certain tax efficiencies and savings would be more or less neutralized by the cost involved in moving the stuff. These are specific managerial stuff, and it was very difficult to afford to have a whole new stuff set up in Cyprus. As for moving the entire management to Russia and establishing a holding or some holding in Russia, it was deemed unacceptable because of the preference of the English law. In Russia, courts do not like using or allowing the companies to use English law, and of course it also would involve significant amendments to the shareholders agreement and the loan covenants, and would have also required lots of changes and reshuffles the managerial staff of our operating companies. The ideal result would be to restructure all of our subholdings, and also to recognize that our company is a tax resident, is a resident in Russia for tax purposes. We will be able to retain our decision-making location in Russia, and at the same time keep our shareholders comfortable in many other aspects. As for the tax savings, as our economists showed, and also because our company will not be selling any assets short term, so that they, as a result, may be eligible to certain preferences as far as the asset sale and dividends in future. This was the option that we accepted. Of course, each case would be unique, and of course, our decision was based on the specific operational profile of our company. And in the context of its suggested amendments, this option will not apply, or we will not stick to offshore jurisdictions, allowing them the choice of their tax residence. Because I understand this is not the position of the Russian tax authorities. Thank you. Thank you, Yelena. I think this very last case was rather illustrative in the context of the ever-changing tax landscape, and also because of certain archaic elements in the business structure, and many of us would have to rely on very thorough analysis of the existing structures, as far as I can understand from the case described, the sort of transformation may be well, required, even if we didn't propose any amendments. So the upside is good in any case. My dear guests, I promised you questions and answers. I deceived you. I have deceived you and apologize. Our time is up. Let me thank all the presenters and speakers. And it's my personal view, but I think our panel was quite interesting and insightful. Probably now we have some better understanding how we go living on in future, and I think this was also very instructive for me. I would try to listen to what our business thinks, at least at the panel side, if not in the audience. Thank you.